Good morning. I'm Doug Larkin from Montclair State University in Montclair, New Jersey. We're located in northern New Jersey, about 10 miles west of New York City. And today we're going to talk about, well, I'm going to talk about our Noyce Track 4 grant. So I'm here today with Dr. Sandra Adams, who's in the back there. Dr. Adams and I have worked previously on Noyce Track 1 grant. During our Noyce Track 1 grant, we had a lot of research questions that we developed that kind of came in the back of our mind as we were doing our Noyce Track 1 work. When the opportunity for a Noyce Track 4 research grant came along, it was a perfect opportunity to investigate those questions a little deeper. So I want to start with that note to encourage people to think about, if you haven't considered applying for a Noyce Track 4, it's a really great opportunity to expand the questions that you already have, especially if you have a Track 1, 2, or 3. And we're not a Research 1 university. And so I think if you even have a small interest, do the webinar, check it out. It's a wonderful opportunity. So I want to start with a little bit of a baseline about what we know about teacher retention before I talk about our project. A lot, and not all, but a lot of previous work on teacher retention has used sampling data from national surveys that look ultimately at the question of, will this first-year teacher become a second-year teacher? I had a science supervisor say to me, the best thing about first-year teachers is that they become second-year teachers. But we wanted to go a little bit deeper, and we wanted to say, what's working in efforts to retain science teachers? And part of this research tradition comes from that search for the good, rather than a search for the pathological. So we're more interested not in the reasons people leave, but in the reasons people stay. And that comes out of work like Sarah Lawrence Lightfoot and Gloria Ladson Billings, thinking about let's look for the good here in this situation. So some of the things that we know, and a lot of this derives from that sampling data, particularly the work of Richard Ingersoll and colleagues who's spoken at this conference before. But we do know that math and science teachers leave the profession at about the same annual rate as teachers in other subject areas. There's a perception that they leave at higher rates, and that may be true for high-need schools and in some other areas, but across the board, they leave at about the same rate. We also know that if we were just replacing retirements, that the supply of new math and science teachers would be sufficient. But the issue of teacher turnover does seem more pressing in math and science, and well, let me say STEM, because we want to include our computer science and engineering and technology colleagues as well, because there are fewer unhired people in those areas. So I have a colleague as a high school principal. When he has a social studies opening, he gets 400 applications. When he has a biology opening, he gets 3. So that's an example of that. So there are enough people to fill those positions, but there's fewer unhired people out there. And we also know it's very hard to predict who's going to stay and who's going to leave. It really is not much better than random chance, guessing, except for a couple key factors. One of those is pedagogical preparation. Is somebody prepared to be a teacher? Ingersoll's work just looks to see, have they had any pedagogical preparation at all in how to teach? That's a question on the SAS data. We like to think that powerful teacher education programs impact that. And I think those of us in the room who've run Noyce programs or even science education, math education programs for a while might be able to point to higher retention rates from well-prepared teachers in high-quality programs. But other than that, it's hard to predict who's going to stay and who's going to leave. So I want to talk a little bit about our study. And what we decided to do is first of all, create a manageable study, one that we could run. We could dream of much larger studies, but we saw how much money we could ask for from NSF and how much time our university was going to give us to do this work. And so we picked 4 states that we would look at: Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and North Carolina. All of them have between 5 to 10, 13 million, people. Population-wise, or roughly in the same category population-wise, and each of them has between 5,000 and 10,000 science teachers. And we are focusing on just secondary science teachers, and I'll talk about why in a moment. And so what we decided to do was to identify school districts in these target states where science teachers were successfully being retained, and then go there and investigate why. And again, that bandwidth question, how much time and money will this take? What can reasonably be done with this study? So we chose 5 to 6 case studies per state, and we're going to focus on teachers in high-need schools, teachers of color, and recipients of Noyce scholarships. And so those 3 criteria are going to help us decide which districts we go visit and see what they're doing to retain science teachers. And I think this is the point where I say, in academia, we're not the only experts. There is a lot of knowledge and expertise out there in the school districts that doesn't always filter up to a wider audience. And so one of the things that we can do with this is tap into that expertise, and as the kids say, put it on blast, and let everybody know what good things are happening in these schools. Okay, so we are at the end of year 1 of this 5-year project. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the data. Year 2, we're going to do New Jersey case studies. Year 3, Pennsylvania. Year 4, Wisconsin. And Year 5, North Carolina. If you are in any of these states, you may get contacted by us to request the names of Noyce scholars in your program. And I'll show you how we will find. That's all. We're not going to email them or anything, but just to track them. And I'll show you how we're going to do that in a moment. So there is a lot of data out there, and we're going to talk a little bit about what data we can use as researchers in Noyce programs to learn more about this question of retention. So a couple of states, Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, another one, they post these staffing lists. For every district, they actually say LEAs because charter schools are included, but they're not technically districts. So every local educational agency posts a list of every teacher and information about that teacher every year. And so one of the things we've been doing is using this as a data source. And in a way, it's turned into a big data project, which is a little unexpected. But it's kind of cool, too. And we're aggregating this data over multiple years. And I want to show you what that looks like. And I want to first just say, don't panic, because I'm going to show you lots of Excel spreadsheets, but you don't really have to take much in other than what I'll point out with the laser pointer here, to take Kathy's laser pointer. So this is what one of those data staffing lists looks like. And I've blurred out the names of the last names just out of courtesy here. But these are publicly available. You could go to the Pennsylvania website. This is the 2009 data. And if you're a teacher, if you're a Noyce scholar or a Noyce graduate out there, every October in most states, someone will come around, an administrator will come around and just check on your information. They'd have to upload that to the state. And some of the things they ask for is your name. Is your name spelled correctly? They'll have your salary there. It'll say how many years experience you have total. That's that first one. How many years you have in the district. That's the second one. What you're certified in. And this is interesting. For some states, they say what you're certified in. Other states, they say, what are you actually teaching? Right? This is one of the findings we've had so far in trying to compare states. And then it'll say what district you're teaching in. So we can take this data and we can aggregate it over multiple years. So this is what it looks like when we aggregate over multiple years. Don't panic. Let's see. It stopped advancing on me. There we go. OK. All right. So here we have Aileen. And again, we have Aileen's data over multiple years. So we have 2009. Aileen disappeared from the data from 2010, 2011. We don't have an explanation why, but we know we don't have data for those 2 years. But then returned to the workforce in 2012 and clearly was retained. Something happened the first year, and then she came back and then was there. So we're going to call her retained because she stayed in the profession for more than 6 years. And I'll talk about why we're picking that in a moment. We can look at her annual salary. It changed from year 1. It went down. And then the 2013 data, it was interesting because what we noticed was that they started her off in year 1 again. So even just from this data, we can ask old questions in new ways. Like, to me, this is a question about the gender wage gap, right? That somebody who had a year experience was not given that year experience. And so we actually had to create another column in the data, real years experience, that we now use. But again, just looking at this data this way allows us to ask these questions. And again, we also noticed that there was a district change there. We don't know why, but again, this tells us something that we can't get from that sampling data about this teacher's life in the workforce. And then we can do this for multiple teachers in multiple states. Okay, when we look at the count of new science teachers, we see that in a state like Pennsylvania, which again, millions of people in Pennsylvania, but between 200 and 400 new science teachers each year. And it ebbs and flows with the economy. And New Jersey's looks somewhat similar. It's the same vertical scale there, between 200 and 400 new science teachers each year. The attrition rates, the important thing here is that the slope on all these graphs is pretty similar. No matter what we start with, how many science teachers we start with, we have a similar slope. And if we look at the actual as a percentage, it's pretty similar over the years in Pennsylvania. New Jersey, what's kind of interesting there is that there's a big change there in 2011 in the retention rates. One interpretation of that is that 2011 was the time there were a lot of public attacks against teachers' unions in our state. We had a very contentious governor's race. There were some YouTube videos. But probably the more logical explanation is that that's the year that the new data system kicked in from the state's Race to the Top application. So 2013 is a sort of a watermark or watershed year in data in state retention, state data systems. Because many states aligned their data systems with the requirements for Race to the Top grants. So my explanation is probably that there's a better data system there. And there's very clear differences in the data over those years. So the last thing I want to mention is just sort of to problematize and trouble the notion of what it means to be retained. We talk about retention at this conference as if it's a single thing. But one of the things we're finding in this project, even after just 1 year of looking at the data, is it can mean multiple things. So in New Jersey, if we look at all of the teachers who were hired in 2010, and their first year was 2010, that's 251 teachers. If we use our database to look and see who's still teaching after 6 years, 101 of those 251 are still in the same school. So clearly, a principal in that school would look at that and say, we retained that teacher. However, another 63 were teaching in a different school from the school where they started. The principal who hired them would say that teacher was not retained, but us looking from the outside, we'd say, yeah, they were retained. They're still public school teachers in the state, and so we can call them retained. Another 10, thank you LinkedIn, helped us figure that out, but another 10 were teaching in other states. 9 of them either became administrators, went into academia, went into informal science education in museums. I locate myself in that group. I don't think I stayed more than 4 years at one school because I had to scratch my feet on different parts of the world. But that was me too. But I consider myself retained in the profession. I'm still doing science education work. But as a researcher, would I consider them retained? Probably not in the way that we're talking about it here. So the green and blue, those first two there, I would consider retained. And then we have people, we could identify 15 people who were definitely not retained. They were, either retired or passed away or were fired or things didn't work out. And then there's another group that we don't have any information on. And to me, that last block is probably the difference between our retention statistics and the SAS retention statistics. When we look at a country, it's always nice to compare yourself to Finland. I have a guidance counselor friend who says comparison is the thief of joy, so I try to keep that in mind too. But in Finland, they have a 90% retention rate for teachers who are prepared and start in the class. They remain in the profession for the duration of their careers. That's a nice goal. So the takeaway messages for this session right now, one is that the term retention doesn't have a universal meaning. So like other things like teaching effectiveness or teacher quality, we have to start out by defining what we mean whenever we're talking about that. Is retention to the district, to the state, to the profession? What are we talking about when we talk about retention? The second point is that the staffing data that we're using, it hasn't been used much. I've only been able to find a couple of researchers who've actually done this kind of research, but I think it's going to become more common now that these, in a post-2013 world, and now we're 5 years past 2013, so we can start looking at retention questions if we're defining retention as 6 years. Which is 6 years, by the way, is the average, that's the average time a wage earner in an education profession, library, or any kind of training profession, that's the average career length before they switch jobs. So that's one of the reasons we picked that. The Department of Labor is 5.2 years, actually. So it's messy, but it's worthwhile if you clean it up. And it leads to very different retention rates in the SAS studies, but some of those SAS studies look for why people leave. We're looking at why people stay. And so this helps us identify the why people stay. To the larger point of our program, we are able to identify districts where people stay, and we're looking forward to going to those states and doing those case studies. And finally, I want to end on a note of hope. My first Noyce conference, we came, and we had promised NSF 10 Noyce scholars, and we came, Dr. Adams and I came, we're like, we only have 6. And we were really nervous that somebody was going to call us out on it, right? And like, oh man, we only have 6. And then we met people like, oh my gosh, you got 6? We only got 3. And so it's an image of, again, comparison, thief of joy. The scale of new science teachers is actually pretty small in a lot of our states. And even big states, where we have millions of people, we're talking about 200 new science teachers per year. If we're producing 6 of those, that's a big deal. And so I want to leave us on a note of hope about our impact of what we're doing here, that even if you only have, and we're preparing them well. We're preparing teachers to look at equity. We're preparing teachers to engage in the way that Dr. Orange was talking about yesterday, we hope, and we're checking ourselves on that with our research. So I want to end with that note of hope that those 1 or 2 students that you were only able to recruit, they matter, and you matter. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ben.